The land we call India has been measured in kings and temples, in languages and lifetimes. But if we could peel away all that history, if we could listen, not to the stories we tell, but to the secrets written in our very cells, a different India would emerge. One hidden in every heartbeat. One more ancient than any monument. Deep beneath the skin of over 1 billion people flows a river far older than civilization itself. A genetic memory, carrying the whispers of ancestors who walked barefoot across forgotten continents, of tribes that rose and fell before a single brick of Mohenjo-daro was ever laid. Close your eyes. Imagine standing at the edge of this river. The air is thick with the scent of monsoon rain. The ground beneath you hums with stories. Whose footsteps echo here? What bloodline surges quietly through the veins of those who till these fields, sing in these temples, or move through these cities like flickers of a forgotten flame? Why does Indian DNA capture some of the oldest human migrations on Earth? How is it possible that one nation holds more surviving Neanderthal genes than almost anywhere else, despite no Neanderthal fossil ever being found here? Why are Indian populations at once more genetically diverse than all of Europe, and yet trapped into thousands of isolated genetic islands? The answers to these questions lie buried in the silent language of our chromosomes, and they are stranger, more beautiful, and more heartbreaking than any myth. Tonight, we set sail down this hidden river, to trace the unseen map written inside us all. A story not of kings or empires, but of mothers and fathers long forgotten, whose DNA still lives inside you, inside me, whispering across the ages, remember. Long before cities were born, before crops took root, and even before language wrapped itself around thought, there were footsteps, quiet, barefoot, and relentless. Somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, a small band of humans crossed into what we now call the Indian subcontinent. They didn't bring bronze. They didn't carry gods. All they had was survival, and in their blood, the blueprint of all who would come after. These earliest settlers weren't part of any great migration wave. They were the wave. Geneticists call them the ASI, Ancient Ancestral South Indians. But that name hides more than it reveals. Because the truth is, this was a population unlike any other in the world. They were not related to East Asians, not to Middle Easterners, not even closely to the peoples of Africa, from where they once departed. Over time, they became a genetic island sealed off, evolving separately, isolated in the deep folds of India's terrain. What makes the ASI so extraordinary is not just their antiquity, but their invisibility. Their faces are lost. No ruins bear their name. Yet in the DNA of tribal groups in central and southern India, and in the uncontacted Anj of the Andaman Islands, the echoes of ASI still resonate, like the hum of a song nearly forgotten. This lineage is so distinct that it diverged from other major human populations tens of thousands of years ago, around the same time as East Asians and Aboriginal Australians went their separate ways. Imagine that. While mammoths still roamed Eurasia, India had already birthed a people genetically unique in all the world. They were hunter-gatherers, masters of jungle paths and river bends, watchers of monsoons and starlit skies. For tens of thousands of years, they left no cities, but they left something even more enduring: genes. Silent, coded, passed from mother to daughter, from father to son. Generation after generation, their DNA wove itself into the blood of future empires. But time is merciless. Waves of newcomers would eventually arrive, from farming cultures in the West and nomads from the North. They would bring tools, rituals, and a hunger to settle. And with them came new genes. The ASI, though never fully erased, would be pushed to the margins of history. Yet they never vanished. Even today, every Indian carries fragments of their story, some more, some less. But in the quiet corners of the genome, far from the noise of politics and identity, the ASI still live. Still walking, still watching, still whispering. You've never seen their temples, but they built the temple of your blood. 5,000 years ago, along the banks of the Indus and Sarasvati rivers, something began that the world would forget for centuries. A civilization arose, quiet, complex, and remarkably ahead of its time. But this was no ordinary birth. It was the result of a fusion so deep, it rewrote the genetic script of an entire subcontinent. To understand how Indian DNA became what it is today, we must travel even further back, to the highlands of ancient Iran. There, among wild barley fields and mountain valleys, lived the early agriculturalists who first tamed the seeds of civilization. These people, genetically distinct from the Fertile Crescent's Levantine farmers, began a slow eastward drift. They didn't come with conquest, they came with cultivation. Somewhere around 7000 BCE, their descendants crossed into the subcontinent. And when they met the ASI, the deep-rooted hunter-gatherers already thriving in the jungles and hills, they didn't erase them. They mingled. They merged. In that merging, the blueprint for South Asia's future was quietly drawn. This hybrid population gave rise to the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the most enigmatic societies in human history. They built cities with sewage systems before Rome, standardized weights before the Greeks, and lived in an urban harmony the modern world still struggles to replicate. Yet what makes them truly extraordinary is not the bricks they laid, but the blood they carried. Genetic analysis now shows that the people of the Indus Valley weren't just a cultural marvel, they were a biological bridge. Their DNA was the missing link between the ancient Iranians and the native ASI, a fusion that would later split and reform as both ANI and ASI, the twin ancestral pillars of Indian identity. What's haunting is this. The Indus people had no written epic, no known kings, no visible tombs. Their cities were orderly, their walls unarmed. And yet, through their genes, their story survives, not in stone, but in skin. When their cities eventually fell into silence, their descendants moved, some northward, some south. In the north, they would mix with newcomers from the steppe. In the south, they would blend deeper with remaining ASI communities. The genetic fork was set in motion, and from it, the Indian cline would emerge. This was not merely a population shift. It was a biological symphony, a carefully layered composition of ancient pulses, woven through centuries of breath and birth. Even today, when researchers extract DNA from Indus-related grave sites, they find something surreal, genes that still whisper in the bones of modern Indians. No monument was raised for the first fusion. No poet recorded its arrival. But in the mirror of your cells, their legacy still dances. Somewhere beyond the Caspian Sea, winds once carried whispers of gods carved in thunder and fire. Nomads rode out across the Eurasian steppe, riders born not to borders, but to horizons. And one day, around 2000 BCE, their hooves crossed into South Asia. They did not bring armies and iron or siege engines of empire. What they carried was far more enduring, language and blood. These were the steppe pastoralists, descendants of the Yamnaya and western steppe herders. Their arrival was not just a moment in history. It was a shift in biological architecture. Because when they mixed with the people of the north, those already shaped by the ancient Indus blend, something new emerged, the high ANI lineage. Their impact was not uniform. They did not wash over the subcontinent like a flood. Instead, they pooled, concentrated. Northern India, especially among Indo-European language speakers and upper castes, absorbed their genes most intensely. But in the south, the fusion was gentler, more diffused, preserving a stronger thread of the older ASI ancestry. This gradient, this invisible slope of ancestry from north to south, is what science now calls the Indian cline. But their legacy wasn't confined to chromosomes. With the steppe came Sanskrit, came Vedic ritual, came echoes of a worldview written not in cities, but in sound, mantras passed by breath and fire. It's no coincidence that the very structure of Indo-Aryan languages carries traces of that distant steppe logic, that nomadic rhythm. And yet, the steppe pastoralists weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They didn't erase the civilizations before them. Instead, their genes interlaced with those already present, layering upon an already complex web. Think of Indian DNA at this point as a palimpsest, not overwritten, but overlaid. Every generation a new line, a new dialect of inheritance. What makes this phase so biologically profound is the velocity of change. In a few hundred years, a fresh ancestral component was introduced into the Indian gene pool, one that had evolved under different climates, diets, and diseases. That kind of sudden genomic mixing left traces scientists can still read today. Alleles that hint at dietary shifts, metabolic changes, even new immunity profiles. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of this fusion isn't in the code. It's in the continuity. Modern Indians didn't just inherit steppe DNA. They wove it into something new. Unlike the Americas or Australia, where arrival meant replacement, in India it meant adaptation, absorption, a rewriting that respected the text beneath. When researchers examine the genes of present-day Brahmins from Bengal or Gujarat, they find something remarkable: extremely high frequencies of steppe-derived haplogroups, like R1A1. But those same genes also carry the ancient signatures of the Indus and the ASI. Like layered paint on a temple wall, the whole story remains, if you know how to see it. The steppe didn't create India, but it helped recompose its genetic melody, adding a sharper note, a faster rhythm, and a new linguistic pulse that still beats today. India once moved to the rhythm of fusion. Tribes met, languages blended, bloodlines merged under open skies. But then, slowly, something shifted. The dance stopped, and the silence that followed reshaped the DNA of an entire civilization. Roughly 2,000 years ago, a barrier descended, not built of stone or steel, but of belief. Communities that once mixed freely began to withdraw. Marriage between groups became taboo. Lineages were sealed. Caste, which had once been fluid, began to fossilize. What followed wasn't merely a change in social custom. It was a continental-scale genetic lockdown. Scientists studying this period found something astonishing. The DNA evidence of mixing, which had been vibrant, constant, suddenly flatlined. In genetic terms, India froze. The mingling that had characterized millennia of subcontinental evolution all but vanished. Each community began turning inward, marrying within their own kind, generation after generation. This shift, now known as the rise of widespread endogamy, would divide over 1 billion people into over 4,000 genetically distinct groups, each with its own inherited signature, each drifting quietly away from its neighbors. The sheer scale of this partition is almost without global parallel. Not even in mountainous Nepal or the tribal highlands of Papua has such fine-grained genetic separation been seen in such close quarters. From a genetic perspective, India became less a nation and more an archipelago. Thousands of islands, each isolated by tradition rather than water. And these weren't just cultural lines. They etched themselves into chromosomes. Over time, limited mate choice amplified rare mutations. Founder effects, where a small group gives rise to a large one, became common. Certain genetic conditions, previously negligible, surged in prevalence. Some populations developed unusually high homozygosity, large chunks of their DNA inherited identically from both parents. This wasn't always visible, but it was real, and it was everywhere. Researchers began finding entire communities where specific disorders clustered, heart conditions in one, autoimmune diseases in another. Genes weren't just carriers of history anymore. They had become mirrors of social division. But there's a deeper tragedy here, because unlocking the doors to outside genes, these communities also locked in their vulnerabilities. Diversity, the genetic shield of human survival, began to erode. And yet, paradoxically, that very erosion created a different kind of value: scientific clarity. India's frozen genetic structure, while costly in health, became a treasure for researchers. Rare mutations that occur once in a million elsewhere can be studied here at scale, naturally amplified by centuries of isolation. In this way, endogamy, though painful, gave rise to one of the richest natural laboratories in human history. Still, it leaves us with questions no genome can answer. How did a civilization so diverse choose division? What stories were lost when mixing ceased? And what happens when walls built from DNA grow taller than any border? India didn't just pause the mixing of people. It crystallized history into bloodlines. And those bloodlines still carry both the memory of fusion and the cost of its absence. In the layered soil of Europe and Siberia, archaeologists unearthed the bones of beings who were almost us, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Their skulls told stories of ancient worlds, of firelit caves and forgotten winters. But in India, there were no such bones. No Neanderthal fossils sleep beneath its soil. And yet, within the living, their presence burns brighter than anywhere else. When researchers sequenced the genomes of over 2,700 individuals across India, what they found defied every expectation. These populations, spread across castes, tribes, and languages, carried not just traces of archaic human DNA, but a staggering diversity of it. In fact, over 90% of all Neanderthal genetic variants known in modern humans were found among Indians. In comparison, a European dataset 10 times larger recovered barely half that number. How can a land with no discovered fossils of these ancient humans preserve more of their DNA than the places they actually lived? The answer lies not in burial grounds, but in biology. Because while Neanderthals may never have set foot deep into India, their genes rode in, embedded in the blood of early modern humans who interbred with them before reaching South Asia. And once those early arrivals entered India, something remarkable happened. Unlike other regions where constant migration diluted ancient DNA over time, India's endogamous structure acted like a genetic vault. Variants that were lost elsewhere throughout breeding remained intact here, silently passed from parent to child, guarded by the very isolation that shaped India's genetic history. But this isn't just about Neanderthals. Indian genomes also show unusually high diversity in Denisovan segments, even though Denisovan fossils have only been found in places like Siberia and Southeast Asia. It's as if India holds fragments of ancient encounters no archaeology has yet confirmed. Fossils without bones. Histories written not in stone, but in the sequences of adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And some of those ancient sequences may still matter. Scientists have begun identifying archaic variants in Indians that potentially influence immunity, metabolism, even neurological traits. These aren't dead genes. They're active ingredients in what it means to be human today. There's something humbling in this realization. The ancestors we call archaic never truly vanished. Pieces of them walk beside us, in our cells, in our health, in our vulnerabilities and strengths. And nowhere is this legacy more vividly alive than in India, where the genetic memory of prehistoric love and survival has endured through thousands of years of caste, conquest, and change. We often look to ruins for history, but perhaps the Real Museum lies within. And in that museum, the Indian genome is a gallery unlike any other, displaying echoes of vanished species with a clarity no skeleton ever could. In the silence of inheritance, not all gifts are blessings. For centuries, India's people have lived in small, self-contained worlds, communities defined not just by language or land, but by the invisible rules of marriage. These weren't simply traditions. They were systems, finely tuned filters that decided who could belong and who could not. And over time, they didn't just shape culture. They sculpted DNA. What began as social custom became genetic destiny. In tightly bound groups, mutations that would normally vanish in larger populations found shelter. Some conferred resilience. Others brought ruin. One such mutation, a tiny deletion in the MYBPC3 gene, is now carried by nearly 4% of people across South Asia. It sits quietly in the heart, invisible for decades, until suddenly it isn't. Until the heart begins to fail. Until stories stop mid-sentence. It's a founder mutation, born long ago in a small group, and preserved by generations of unknowing repetition. Elsewhere, in a community known as the Reddy caste of southern India, another pattern emerged. High rates of a severe spinal disorder led researchers to a single culprit, the HLA-B*27:0, 4 allele. It didn't arrive by chance. It came from a shared ancestor. In a world of closed circles, one gene can ripple through time like a silent epidemic. And then there are the blood battles, where ancient adaptations once meant survival, and now demand caution. The sickle cell trait, once a weapon against malaria, is carried by up to 40% of some tribal populations. G6PD deficiency, a quirk of enzymes, ranges from rare to rampant, depending on the village. Thalassemia haunts entire regions. These aren't just medical facts. They're fingerprints of evolutionary pressure meeting cultural walls. Every isolated group becomes, over time, its own genetic experiment. One tribe may carry resilience against infection. Another may face elevated cancer risks. In some, neurological conditions appear with eerie consistency. In others, rare metabolic disorders pass from grandparent to grandchild, like a cursed inheritance. But in this landscape of risk, there's also revelation. Because when a condition repeats, when a gene appears again and again in a single population, scientists can see clearly what is often hidden in the genetic fog of diverse, outbred groups. They can isolate the mutation, trace its path, understand its mechanics. This is why India has become a global goldmine for medical discovery. It's not just the volume of people, it's the structure, the bottlenecks, the founder effects, the thousands of mini-populations, each with their own locked vault of mutations. They don't just hold suffering, they hold secrets. And yet, this legacy is bittersweet, because every breakthrough begins in pain. A child's diagnosis, a pattern noticed, a history uncovered not in books, but in symptoms. These are the stories written in nucleotides, stories that never cross caste lines, but travel deep within them. Isolation carved vulnerability into strength, disease into discovery. And now, the world is learning what India's hidden genomes have always known, that every closed circle, no matter how tight, still echoes far beyond its edge. We often imagine that geography shapes our genes, that rivers divide, mountains isolate, and distance determines difference. But in India, this rule collapses. Because here, it wasn't terrain that carved genetic boundaries. It was the words people spoke. In most parts of the world, neighboring populations tend to share genetic similarities. Villages just a few kilometers apart often have overlapping ancestry. But in India, scientists discovered a strange inversion. Two communities living side by side could be more genetically distant than people separated by entire continents, if they spoke different languages. This wasn't a minor anomaly. It was a pattern, deep, consistent, and stretching across the subcontinent. Indo-European speakers in the north showed stronger genetic ties to populations of Central Asia and Europe. Dravidian speakers in the south reflected a richer blend of ancient local ancestry. Tibeto-Burman speakers in the northeast leaned toward East Asian gene pools, and Austroasiatic groups, like the Munda, carried lineages more aligned with Southeast Asian hunter-gatherers. The line that separated them wasn't drawn on a map. It was drawn in syllables. These linguistic divisions acted like invisible walls, harder than stone, sharper than border fences. They shaped marriage patterns, controlled social interaction, and over time, froze entire populations into distinct genetic clusters. Unlike Europe, where genetic flow generally correlates with how far people live from each other, India created a paradox: proximity without blending. One might expect that centuries of coexistence would lead to gradual genetic smoothing, that languages would blur, and so would bloodlines. But India defied that logic. Instead, speech became a code for ancestry. To speak a tongue was not just to communicate, but to belong, to a past, to a people, to a genetic identity sealed over generations. Researchers realized this was more than coincidence. In India, language families aligned shockingly well with distinct genetic signatures, something rarely seen elsewhere. Even among populations that had adopted a different language over time, genetic markers often betrayed a deeper, older ancestry. Why did this happen here? Perhaps because in India, language was never just about sound. It was entwined with caste, with ritual, with status and tradition. To speak differently was to live differently, to eat, marry, and pray within walls built not of earth, but of grammar. And so, a landmass that had once seen wave after wave of genetic admixture gradually divided itself, not by terrain, but by tongue. Communities that lived on the same soil for 1,000 years could remain biologically apart, because their languages kept their lineages locked. It's a haunting idea that your DNA could trace not where you come from, but what your ancestors spoke, that your family tree is rooted not in a place, but in a sound. In India, language wasn't just a tool. It was a gatekeeper, silently sorting genes long after the words themselves had changed.